Just a quick note about today's episode. Unfortunately, we were unable to save Kevin's audio, so the conversation presented here has been edited down to just Bill, Stephen, and myself. Our apologies go out to Kevin Hobby, but the show must go on, so sit back and we hope you enjoy. This is Now and Zen, the podcast about microtonal music, alternative tuning systems, and the musicians exploring this space, hosted by me, Sevish.
And I'm Stephen Weigel.
Our guests today, Bill Sethares and Kevin Hobby, have engaged in research that suggests there are many ways to achieve consonance beside the common approach of using just intonation. One outcome of these ideas is the realization of a new instrument, the hyperpiano. This, and I'm sure many other topics, we'll be discussing today on Now and Zen, so let's welcome our guests. Hey Bill, hey Kevin, how are we doing today?
Hi, great. And thanks for having us on the show.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So why don't you both give a short introduction about yourselves and what you're up to?
Sure. So my name is Bill Sethares. I've been doing microtonality for a number of years. I first got into it, I bought an old synthesizer, a TX-81Z by Yamaha.
Oh, nice.
And because I'm kind of an electrical engineer by trade, I do geeky things like read the manual. And one of the things in the manual is they had the notes that would be sounded, the pitches that would be sounded, were programmable. So instead of it, this key always being this note, you could make any key be any note. And I remember thinking when I first encountered that, that's really weird. What would be fun to do? And so the first thing I ever did was to flip the keyboard around so that the low notes are on the right and the high notes are on the left. And right. So and now you just play regular, right? With regular. And of course, everything sounds really weird. And you go, oh, wow, that's really cool.
Oh, that's incredible.
And then the next thing I did is I said, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make every note on the keyboard black and white a part of the blues scale. Okay, and now what you can do is like mash your fists down and like everything sounds good. And then I was looking a little more carefully at the documentation and it said, well, now wait a minute. It's not just that you choose which note you want sounded. You can actually tune them any way you a little bit up, a little bit down. And I thought, wow, well, why would you do that? And then I started poking around, and this is a little before the internet let you just instantly Google everything. And I finally stumbled across this idea of other equal temperaments than 12. So that's where I started. I started playing with 19-tone equal temperament. I started playing with 13 tone equal temperament. I started playing 16. Just whatever there's only a limited number of numbers, right?
Right.
So I started looking at each of them, and so what led to my work, right? The tuning timbre kind of idea, is I noticed by just raw experimentation that some of these different weird equal temperaments were easier to play in than others.
Amen.
So, like 19, you mentioned 19 earlier when you got out, you showed me your 19 tone equal temperate acoustic guitar. And 19 is really cool because there's lots of things that sound familiar and then some things that don't sound familiar. And so I played around in 19 for quite a bit. And then I went to others like 16 and 10. And what you observe is it's really hard to find even pairs of notes that sound nice and consonant in something like 10 tone equal temperament.
Right.
Of course, there's the octave, right? You've always got the octave. That's your
Right, but that
bass.
doesn't count. Yeah.
But yeah, in some sense, that doesn't count. So then, but like the thing that should be a fifth was like really quite far off. I guess it's, I can't remember in sense now, 520 is it, or 480 or something like that.
Well,
And
720 is the fifth, and then
720
480 is the
fifth,
fourth.
and 480s, yeah. And so they're really far off, and yet some sounds are kind of okay. And so that kind of got me making big lists. Okay, silly me, I got out a piece of paper and I said, 10 tone equal temperament. I can use the xylophone sound. I can use the this. Oh, don't never use the violin or 10 tone equal temperament. So I just made these lists, and I kept thinking to myself, so there's some pattern here. I just don't see what it is.
How the notes sound together.
Yeah, what's the pattern? What makes one of these things work and not others? And so then fast forward a couple years later, I kind of came up with the idea. So one thing electrical engineers always do is you always move things over into the frequency domain. So you look at things in terms of a fundamental and some overtones. In most sounds, the overtones are all nice harmonics of that fundamental. So you kind of observe that, hey, in 12-tone equal temperament, where we normally live, those harmonics lie in nice locations relative to the notes of the scale. And so that when you play multiple notes together, you end up with nice, easy pairs. And of course, triplets that we call chords and other things like this. That got me thinking about moving the overtones around a little bit. Then a couple years after that, I ran across this paper by these guys named Plomp and Levelt.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, I had never looked really at the Journal of the Acoustical Society before. Please forgive me, because it should have, now it would be the most obvious place to go. But so then I found that paper, and it gave a great explanation for 12-tone equal temperament, and then it just stopped.
Surprise, surprise, surprise.
Yeah, well, it just stopped. And here I am with my stupid lists, right? And I thought, well, the same idea you could do in any equal temperament.
Yes.
And so that was kind of what got me started originally. And basically, most everything I've played around with since then, in the past 20 years or so, has been kind of like offshoots of that.
Yeah.
So I don't know, is that enough of an introduction?
That's great.
Fantastic introduction.
I was wondering, since you have written Tuning Timbre Spectrum Scale, the idea is that if you have any given sound, then there's a way to make the spectrum agree with your tuning without having to use certain sounds. Or you can even use harmonic sounds, but then if you tweak the partials a bit, things will agree more. Can you sort of explain how that works?
Okay, maybe, yeah. So here's one of those things where it depends a little bit on what your background is. So the mechanics of it go something like this. When you take a sound, say a guitar sound or a organ sound, or any kind of sound you want to think about, and you look at its spectrum, and the spectrum is essentially a recipe that says this sound is built up out of these overtones, these partials that have this particular relationship to each other. Now, when you represent that visually, of course, it's a picture, it's a graph. In your computer, it's represented as a collection of numbers. So there's a long vector. Many of the elements are small. That's where the overtones aren't. And many of the elements are big. And that's where the overtones are. So the process of moving overtones around in your computer is quite simple. What you do is you calculate that vector. So there's standard algorithms for doing that. And then you move those elements that are the overtones from where they are to where you want them. The two pieces of that are, how do you know where you want them? Okay, and that's basically this plump and leveled kind of idea that you can parlay into a reasonable approximation to the destination that you'd like to achieve with your overtones. And then the other part is the mechanics of how you move them, and that's a little algorithm for shuffling numbers around in your computer. So those are the two answers that you can think about. And yeah, so you can do stuff like take a guitar, say that's a regular guitar sound with its harmonic overtones, tweak the overtones a little bit, move them around, and then it kind of works better in 10-tone equal temperament than it did originally. And there's not really limits to, there are limits to what you can do, how far you can move overtones without destroying the integrity of the sound. There's also limits if you move them just a teeny weeny bit, it hardly makes any difference. You're not really sensitive to the positions of each and every overtone in a sort of slap you in your face way.
Right.
However, when you move them all around, you achieve a sort of global effect that's feels much larger than moving an individual one around. Originally, when I was playing around with these things, I did everything in software, basically. It was all synthesized because that was how I knew how to do it. And I always really wanted to make, real instruments, acoustic instruments that could do this same kind of spectral mapping or warp these things. And, so you think of strings, you think of keyed instruments like xylophone or glockenspiel, so how do you do it though? Right? Like a string, they go to great lengths when they manufacture strings to make them have harmonic overtones. The whole manufacturing process is geared to do that, obviously to make it strong, to make it thin and, light so that it has nice properties. But really it's all about making a nice harmonic string. And now here I'm thinking, oh yeah, I want it to be non-harmonic. I want it to be, I want to do something completely different. So how do you, and I always had in the mind, this is what we ought to do, but I had no idea how to physically do it. Now the first part actually, at some point, I stumbled on a paper by these two Australian guys named Kalatis and Lee. And it's a great paper. I think it's from mid-90s, something like this. And I read this paper, and what they do is they show you how to, so if you have a single piece of a string, say a couple inches long or something like that, just to visualize it, it is itself a little harmonic oscillator. That is, it has all its overtones in a harmonic series. And if you attach that to another one, another string, now different size or else, different density or different, then
is it different lengths?
Though each piece, different lengths, different materials, even different densities,
anything.
Whatever, different properties. And then even though each one of them individually would be harmonic, together they create a system that's inharmonic. And what they showed is how you solve the equations to do that.
Wow. So
at the time I was really excited, and I wrote a little Mathematica program to, here, let me reproduce their results to make sure, that's the first thing you do as a scientist, right? Are these guys right? Okay. And it looked okay, it's all the tests that I could run or think of running. And so I sort of believed it. And then Kevin called up, or, we got into communication, and he said, yeah, I'm really interested in this string. I said, okay, Kevin, I think I know how to do the software part of it, right? I know how to predict, given a string, given an inharmonic string contour, I can predict what it's going to do. I said, but here's the problem. I don't know how to manufacture this stuff. What are we going to do? Call up Gibson and say, can you get your little string fairies to wind it funny for two? I was just felt hopeless. And what I remember is Kevin said, oh, okay, that's right. Let me think about that. And then he came back, I don't know, not that long later, maybe a few days, a week later. He said, hey, actually that might not be that hard. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, look, how do they make these strings? if you think of a guitar string, it's got a central core.
Yeah.
And then there's a wrap, right? There's another wire that's wrapped around that core.
Right.
So what if we unwrap that wire, say halfway or something? Now we've got a string with two pieces in it. And it was just like this little light bulb went off. And it was like, duh, right? Of course you can do that. We don't need, so, I mean, now it's constrained. We can only manufacture strings with, well, the original conception was two parts, but of course you can unwrap from both sides, right? Or you could unwrap from the middle. So you could wrap, cut, unwrap. So, so now it seemed feasible. So then we started, I mean, I got all excited. I don't know about you, Kevin, but I thought, wow, this is really cool. And so we did the responsible thing. We said, all right, let's test and make sure. So our very first experiment was we took a string that, whose properties we knew. We unwrapped it a certain amount of distance. I predicted what it ought to be. And then Kevin built a little monochord instrument, recorded it. And sure enough, it was like spot on.
Wow.
That's awesome. Where you use pitch tracking software to measure it?
Well, I used general purpose. I used Mathematica, so that's basically running an FFT. The trouble, pitch tracking isn't quite what you want to do because you need to track all the overtones independently.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's really a little more than pitch tracking. It's really overtone tracking, if you want to give it a name like that. I mean, fortunately, there are nice algorithms for doing that.
Yeah.
In the engineering community, we have these things called Fourier Transforms, and there's a thing called the short-time Fourier Transform, which lets you measure over time how the spectrum is changing effectively. And so using those kind of standard methods, we could measure the sound that was being produced. We could compare that to the predictions, and bam, we were spot on. So then now the question is, well, now we can manufacture a class of different strings. Which one should we make? And so Kevin said, well, how about if you make a little simulation that, so that I can hear the different ones. And so I thought that was a great idea. Put all the responsibility on Kevin for making the hard choice. And all I had to do was write a little program that essentially you have a slider and it tells you, okay, I've unwound my string so far proportionally to the slider. And then you press a button that says play, and it gives you an emulation of what that should sound like. So I made a couple of variations on that for Kevin, and he played around with them for quite a while, and then finally found one, and he said, this is it. This is the one we have to do. And that was the one that's in the Hyperpiano.
Yes.
Right.
And he picked it for a bunch of logical. I say, I think if it had been up to me, I would have gone for one that was really weird sounding, And Kevin wanted one that was sort of correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin. It felt to me that he wanted one that was like a bridge between regular and something weird, right? And so then that's the interesting thing about the Hyperpiano is it has a shape. The sort of dissonance curve shape is effectively like a stretched version of the regular one. So it has a familiar shape, which gave it something of a familiar sound. I mean, maybe that's, I don't know how true that is, but it feels like that anyway.
Because the Hyperpiano is tuned, correct me if I'm wrong, it's tuned like a whole tone scale, right? But then the spectra are created so that the octave is dissonant, and the double octave, which you call the hyper-octave, is concordant with the spectra. So it forces people to really reevaluate a lot of the musical things they've been taught, but in a different way than just presenting a different equal temperament would do.
So, okay, there's one final chapter in this saga of the strings, and because now we have the ability to solve it in one direction. If you give me a geometry, I can tell you the sound. And that's pretty laborious because now you have to listen to every possible geometry to decide which one you like.
Trial and error. Are there a lot?
Trial and error. So wouldn't it be nice, wouldn't it be cool if you could essentially go backwards? That is, say, here's the spectrum I want. How do I design the contour of a string to give me that spectrum?
Were you able to do that?
Yes. So that's the subject of our second paper about this. We first submitted it to the Journal of the Acoustical Society, and it got rejected. And they said, this is interesting work, and we think it should be published, but it's not really acoustics.
What?
So, well. Okay. So what they said is you should submit it to the Journal on Applied Acoustics. I guess academic journals have their own little turfs that they play in.
Ugh.
And so anyway, we sent it to the Journal of, so that's where it ended up, was the Journal of Applied Acoustics. And but yeah, it basically takes the Colodus and Lee method and then sticks a loop. I mean, okay, the idea is simple. You take the Colodus and Lee method of the sort of forward problem, given an architecture, what's its spectrum, and then you put a loop around that where you slowly modify the different parameters. And then you assess, am I getting closer to my desired spectrum or further away? And then, of course, if you're getting closer, you reward and continue in that direction. And if you're getting further away, you punish and go in some other direction.
So you're having the computer do iterations to figure it out.
Yes, so it's essentially an iterative method. Like, usually I would run these overnight. It feels to me like that's the limit on how long computer programs can run. Because, like, if it's longer than overnight, you need your computer back, right?
Yeah.
You need your computer in the morning. But, overnight, heck, silly things just sitting there all night long.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So in the paper, when we did a bunch of examples, and we basically designed strings for all the equal temperaments. So, how should the non-uniformity look for each of the equal temperaments, and then we did a smattering of other ones that we thought were interesting or might be interesting to somebody. When you're running this loop, it's going to make parts of the string fatter and parts of the string skinnier, right? That's
right.
Kind of what it does. What if it makes one really, really fat and one really, really skinny?
That's a lot harder.
It can even make negative widths.
Oh, no.
So obviously you just have to throw those answers away, right? I mean, it's a computer program. It doesn't actually know what it's doing. So after a while, you stick a little check and you say, if things are getting negative, then reflect them or, make them positive, basically. But yeah, so that's the thing about iterations like that is when they work, they've worked because they give you an answer that's good for the problem. And if they don't work, well, you try again. Or maybe no answer exists.
Right.
So those are those are the things that can happen. Yeah.
Cool. About the strings that you're using for, say, the Hyperpiano, it makes sense that it would work well for a piano because the hammer would strike the string at the same place every time. But could any of this approach be applied to something like a guitar?
Ooh.
Or is it totally unreasonable?
Okay, so in principle, absolutely yes. Kevin and I have spent a good bit of time talking about this. Here's the issue. Okay, imagine that you have a string which is physically an inharmonic string. So say it's skinny and then fat. Now, it has a certain timbre, right? But the physics of it give you a certain timbre. Now, when you fret that string, what you've done is you've changed the ratio of the fat to the skinny part.
Ah, yeah.
Right.
And so you're changing the pitch, of course, because you're changing the length of the string. That's kind of obvious. As it gets shorter, it gets higher. But you're also changing the relations amongst the overtones.
Wow.
And so, yes. So could we do, in principle, I'm sure there exist 6-string inharmonically strung instruments, but I've yet to come up with a good way of trading off or combining those two aspects of change, the sort of the pitch aspect of change along with the timbral aspect of change. It's more complicated, and I mean, okay, yes, it's possible, Sevish. Of course, we can do it. Yeah. Do I know how to do it exactly? No. And so so when we were thinking about this, the guitar 6 strings, that's the obvious thing you're looking for, right? Because but let's just first simplify to 2 strings.
Sounds good.
Or even let's simplify to a monochord.
Nope.
Okay, so for a monochord, that way I can simply calculate for each possible fret location. So if you think about what it is for a monochord, it's basically a dissonance curve as given by the, say, currently fretted string. And then as you change pitch, you also have to change the relation of the overtone. So you get effectively what is a new kind of dissonance curve that has not only the same tone slid against each other, but the same tone as modified by the physics of the inharmonic string as it slides against each other.
Right.
And so for a monochord, we can calculate it. But a monochord isn't really a very interesting instrument.
No.
I mean, maybe there's some monochord enthusiasts. I'm sorry if I insult you. You're
gonna lose all our monochord fans.
We're gonna lose. Oh yes, forgive me. But now let's take just the next step. 2 strings. Now it becomes not a dissonance curve that changes as you change pitch and hence overtones. It becomes the 2 of them do the same thing. And so it effectively bulges out a dimension. And so you've got some sort of 3-dimensional thing. This is about where we get lost. How to visualize it, how to calculate with it, how to decide what's good. We haven't sorted that out.
A couple of times you've mentioned about dissonance curves. So I wondered if you could explain exactly what that means.
Oh, yes.
Yes, dissonance curves. Okay, so imagine you have a sound, say a guitar pluck or something like this. And now, if you play 2 of that guitar pluck, same note, together, you get, of course, a unison. And that's the sort of most consonant kind of interval you can have.
Right.
If you play it in an octave, then that's the sort of next most consonant interval, as you would imagine. So the theory that Plomb and leveled, which really comes from a sort of Helmholtz, on the sensation. I mean, so there's a long tradition of this kind of thinking about how consonance and dissonance might work. And and I should point out, I don't want to get too many asides, but there are competing theories. So this is one branch of explanation for how consonance and dissonance function. And in this branch, dissonance is caused by 2 overtones which are close to each other but not too close. So if you think about that, it makes a little bit of sense. If it's really, really close, then it's essentially the same note. The beating that you get from the two overtones together is a very smooth, sort of harmonious, kind of almost a vibrato-y like thing that you would consider pleasant. If you get them too far apart, then what you essentially hear is, 2 separate notes that sort of in some sense don't interact. They're like, and then in between, there's a region where the 2 overtones interact, they beat against each other, and they beat at a speed proportional to the frequency difference. And Helmholtz, for instance, basically guessed or intuited that somewhere around a 25 to 35 hertz beat was the maximum roughness, he called it, or dissonance in the music would be the musical term. And then effectively what you do is, since there's many pairs of overtones in a sound, you add up all of these roughnesses, and that gives you sort of an overall measure of the dissonance or roughness. So yes, there's many refinements of this model. And so Plomb and leveled actually just looked at sounds with all equal overtones. So that's like a harsh organy kind of sound, if you think about it. That was very shortly after them, a couple of Japanese researchers were intrigued by this Kamioka and Kuryogawa, and they extended this similar model to different amplitudes. And then a number of different models over the years were proposed. Yeah, so in tuning timbre spectrum scale, one of the things that I did was I kind of turned this into a simple formula. So rather than sort of it being a qualitative model, I essentially created an equation. It's a fairly simple one with, if you know what the number E is and E raised to some powers, then it basically involves that. And that model is what allows you to do these kinds of calculations. It essentially numericizes this idea of really close is okay, really far is okay, and somewhere in the middle it gets more dissonant. What is a dissonance curve was your question. So a dissonance curve is you essentially look at, imagine now sliding that, holding one of the 2 guitar sounds fixed, sliding the other up microtonally as you go to all different pitches. And what you'll find is that at certain intervals, you get dips in the dissonance. So those would be the consonant intervals. For a guitar string, those would be familiar locations to you. The octave we mentioned, the musical 5th, the 4th, near the 3rd, near the minor 3rd. And if you look at them closely, of course, you'll see that they're actually at just intonation intervals. The story that I was telling earlier, where you move the overtones around, what the effect of moving the overtones around is is to move the location of those minima around a little bit.
Right.
So to take the minimum that's a nice consonant fifth and making it, say, 480 hertz, if you wanted to play in 10-tone equal temperament. That would be the kind of thing you would do.
Right, yeah. Powerful idea, really.
It reminds me of Paul Ehrlich's harmonic entropy. Kind of the same idea, where your idea is a bit more nuanced with what the actual sound is doing, and Paul's is more about discovering, like, rational numbers correspond to just intonation, but, like, some rational numbers just stick out more to us, and it's sort of about, like, finding what that is based on different values.
Okay, let me say it a slightly different way.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that there are sort of competing theories for how dissonance and consonance arise. So the Helmholtz, Plomp, and Levelt, and my theory that sort of follows in that vein, are based on this idea that we're looking at the overtones of a sound and the overtones interact.
Yeah.
The main sort of competing theory, if you will, has to do with periodicity. So it's a time domain concept rather than a frequency domain concept. And when you look at things in the periodicity domain or in the time domain, I would say what harmonic entropy is it's the sort of right way of talking about how different sounds interact, i.e. in terms of consonance and dissonance, from that periodicity perspective, from the time domain perspective, rather than from the Fourier perspective.
Oh, yeah. That's a good way of explaining it.
Yeah, and so that's why it's so important. I mean, we're talking about consonance and dissonance, but more fundamental than consonance and dissonance as a perception is our perception of pitch. And there are essentially two theories about how pitch works. One is essentially called the place theory. One is basically a frequency domain theory, and that has physiological evidence for it as well as psychoacoustic evidence for it. And the competing theory is, again, a time domain theory that is a periodicity-based theory. And these two have been fighting each other for, well, Galileo talked about what is essentially the periodicity theory. Helmholtz probably created I don't know whether he created it, but certainly that's how I learned about it, the sort of frequency domain method. And what's interesting about pitch, and I suspect the same is true about consonance and dissonance, is that neither theory explains everything.
Right.
That is to say, there are some effects which are nicely explained by frequency and not by periodicity. There are others for which the opposite is true.
Right.
And so what pitch people have come to believe now is that essentially both mechanisms work in our brains.
Yeah.
And so I think there's the sort of, though there were dozens of years when people were, the periodists were fighting against the frequentists, and they had, it was basically big arguments in the technical literature. We're right, you're wrong, we're right, you're wrong. And I think they've come to a standoff or a reconciliation, perhaps would be a better way to say it, where it's essentially believed now that both mechanisms are in play. So when you detect the pitch of a sound, it feels like a single thing to you. If you think internally about what it's like, you would imagine pitch is a thing,
right? And
that's not really true. It's two things at least, and the winner, effectively, of some internal dialogue comes out and gives you that feeling that that's the pitch. So I think it would be wise to imagine that the story for consonants is the same thing. That is, the frequentists, the people who think in the frequency domain, explain some things really nicely. I mean, that's what I'm happy with having explored. And the people doing the periodicity stuff, they can explain other things. And so that's why I think the harmonic entropy is such an important complement to the dissonance curves, because it's the sort of counterpart in that other realm.
I was going to ask if there were any examples of traditional music that were using inharmonic timbres and tunings.
So this was back in the early 1990s, and when I was first kind of looking at it's a theory, right? And it explained very nicely Western musical practice in the sense that just intonation is basically what you get out of this system for harmonic sounds. And so there was exactly this question: what about other possible musical systems? So I went to Indonesia, and I measured every note of about 40 different gamelons. And there's two basic kinds of gamelons. There's essentially one that's a 5-note scale and a 7-note scale, slendro and palog. And by doing this, I was able to be sort of partially happy. Meaning, the slendro scale correlates really, really nicely with a combination of the bonang-like instruments, which are these inverted gong-like, small bonangs are like small gongs. If you pictured a pot and pan upside down that you were hitting with some little dimples in it, that's kind of what they look like. And so if you take the sound of the bonang and sort of combine it with a harmonic sound, such as you have in the gamelan orchestras with both the voice and the string instrument and also the flute-like instrument, then you can draw curves, dissonance curves, and the minima fall very nicely at those locations where the slendro tends to be tuned. That was really, I thought that made me incredibly happy because it sort of meant that, if you only have one example of something,
right,
maybe the parameters are jiggered by Plumb and Leveled or by me or whoever to make it work in that one case.
Absolutely.
And so then the following on that same idea, there's in Thailand, they have a tradition called the Gong Circle, which is sort of vaguely similar to a gamelan. If you don't know anything about the music, it's like the gamelan. Obviously, if you know about the music, it's nothing like the gamelan. But it's basically, instead of a 5-tone scale, it's a 7-tone scale. And here we could use the same kinds of ideas. Instead of the bonang combined with the harmonic sound, it's the renat, which is one of the instruments in basically like a
xylophone, right?
Like a xylophone style instrument. And if you look at the spectrum of the renat and the harmonic and combine them in the same way, then you also get a dissonance curve with minima that occur at the minima of, very close to the minima of the scale that they play, the ensemble in.
Yeah.
So again, that was great. Now, let me say, I tried to do the same thing. You know what an mbira is? It's thumb piano.
Yeah.
It's a South African instrument. And at one point, I finagled a trip to Zimbabwe, and I went around and I measured a whole bunch of different mbiras and tried to ask the same question for them. And I've not been able to figure out. So, yes, multiple examples, but unfortunately, it's not universal.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wouldn't expect it to be.
Well, no, you wouldn't, but, you should at least try, right?
Still a great theory. Yeah, of course.
There are musical traditions that do not do it this way, for sure. I think. Unless I missed somehow what the variation is, but...
This is kind of a segue into something I've always wanted to ask you about those curves, because you have the dissonance curve. That's like a tool that gives you more information about what is going to blend sound-wise and what won't. So are you ever interested in making music where the blend is just absolutely, like, sort of an anti-blend? Because I know that, like, I sometimes make music that has wolf fifths in it, but, like, it's also interesting to think about, like, how could I make a wolf out of, like, a pure major third with the right timbre, and then tell people it's a pure major third and watch them freak out,
What this gives you, if you think about it, is, you can think of it as, I want to be at the minima of the dissonance curve, right? Because that's going to be the most consonant interval, right? But, you don't want things to be consonant all the time, right? Consonance is a piece of music, and so what the dissonance curves allow you to do, and this is the way I try to usually say it, they allow you control over the amount of dissonance.
Right.
So if you as the composer say, this is a piece of my song, my instrumental, my whatever it is you're making, here's a place where the dissonance should increase and increase and increase, and then it gives you a tool to do that. Right. You can retune so that instead of being on the bottom of the dissonance curves, you're up at the top.
Absolutely. When I play the octave on the hyper-octave piano, it doesn't sound like a wolf to me, but it sounds like kind of muddy, and it's like when you are on a piano and, like, you don't know that playing a low triad is just going to sound yucky because it's kind of not it's not voiced in a way where you can have some space. Like, that's what the octave on the hyper-octave piano sounds like.
So, another factor here is you're familiar, hopefully, with the Bohlen-Pierce scale.
Oh!
So this is the...
Look what I'm doing right now. Can you see that?
I see the piano, but...
Oh, yeah, it's in 13 notes that repeat, so I'm going to be playing a song in Bohlen-Pierce, like, today.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And then redoing it again for on 12, since that's
cool.
soon.
Cool. So there's a sort of similarity in conceptually between the Hyperpiano system and the Bohlen-Pierce scale, and that is that we're imagining that theoretically the unit of repetition is that, well, in the Bohlen-Pierce scale, that factor of 3, or in the hyper-octave, the factor of 4.
Yeah.
Now, you have a very strong, quite overly learned familiarity with 2 to 1.
Yeah.
And so it's extremely hard to sort of cast off that cultural conditioning, if you will, or learned response to the octave. And so, I know that when I've been playing in Bohlen-Pierce, often I'll just slip back into octaves just by accident. For instance, say you're playing multiple instruments and you want to double something.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, right? And you just happen to double it at the octave instead of the factor of 3. And it's going to sound, kind of like you've doubled the instrument.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Even though you've kind of violated the spirit of what that scale is suggesting. Or you've in some sense you've undermined what the scale is trying to show you.
Yeah.
And I think that same exact thing is easy to do with the hyperoctave system as well.
Yeah.
Right.
My one song in Bohlen-Pierce right now does that, and it uses a sound that's really like someone talking almost, and it's kind of wavy. So the 37 or so cents off of the pseudo octave doesn't even matter in that part. So, well, what's the situation with the hyperpianos right now? Because I know the hyperpiano using the hyper octave, there's a complete version of that, right? And is the 10-tone one sort of on the way or whatever, or is that one done too?
Where did we leave that? I think didn't we put up the 10-tone synthesizer?
While the synths are out.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's up on the same website. Not many people have played around with that, as far as I know.
The real hyperpiano?
No, the 10-tone version.
Oh, I have the 10-tone version on mine. I really want to write a song with it, actually.
Please do.
Because I can use a guitar trick to make my 12-tone guitar sound like it's in 10.
Okay.
Although it's not going to be highly accurate, but it won't matter because I'm going to use vibrato. So, yay.
Yes, vibrato solves all ills.
Yes, tasteful. I read in, I think, Richard Parncut's paper that in some genres like opera, the singers can be about 80 cents off, and it still works if,
Because they've got so much...
Right, if the contours are correct, they could theoretically, maybe if you had a pitch from 12-tone equal temperament and another pitch above it, let's say on the lower pitch, you're singing 80 cents too high. Well, maybe on this next pitch, you consistently sing 30 cents too high. So maybe you really have something in between those two locations that still sounds like a semitone. And if you're avoiding the sense of blend on those individual pitches, it's going to sound fine because you're still slotting it in a 12-tone equal tempered framework. Have you ever been surprised by what happens with dissonance curves and timbres? Because I know that we have dissonance curves and those give us either concordant results or discordant results, but have you ever come up with a dissonance curve and said, oh, okay, this interval should be concordant, played it and been oh man, that's not concordant at all?
Here's the thing that maybe is most striking.
Yes.
Let's say so you have a sound and you move the overtones just a little bit. Mm-hmm. Well, the sort of overall timbral quality of the sound doesn't really change very much. Mm-hmm. If it started as a guitar, it's still a guitar-like sound.
Yeah.
And as you move them a little more, it becomes a little less like a guitar, but still pretty recognizable. And as a string family instrument, say, or something like this. Okay. Now, what happens when you move things a lot?
Mm.
So when you move things a lot, first of all, several different things can happen. one thing that can happen is the sound can completely lose its structural integrity.
Yeah.
Instead of being one sound, it becomes a mosh of stuff. And it's no longer perceivable as one thing anymore. It's, maybe it's two things or an indeterminate number of things. So here was the thing that at one point really surprised me. Okay, I was playing around with stretched octaves, stretched overtones, and I was stretching by about 2.1 and maybe 2.2. So I was that's a lot of stretch. Right, instead of an octave, I stretched out to like an octave. And
you mean the ratio is 2.1 to 1?
Yeah, instead of 2 to 1.
Holy moly, that's a lot. Yeah,
it's a lot. So it was stretched a real lot, and of course you don't just stretch the octave. You stretch the fifth and all of the overtones stretch so that you get so that the intervals are just the stretched intervals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so here's what happened. I recorded this piece that was sort of like in my mind. And as I was hearing it, as I was playing, it was this little, like a guitar, I was like arpeggiating chords, sort of like an A minor stretched in 2.2, a C stretched in 2.2, and then I added on like a little flute stretched in 2.2, and I was like, okay. And so I'm hearing this thing, and it's kind of cool, and okay. And I recorded a sketchy version, and I played it for my friend Tom, who was around, and he like looked at me. And he said, okay, Bill, what do you think's going on here? And I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, there's like, sort of like an A minor chord, and it's going to a C chord, and then up to this other thing, and then the flute comes in. He said, well, wait a minute. He said, I don't hear any of that. I mean, I hear like this big mass of sinusoidal stuff undulating.
Oh, that's interesting.
So you asked about surprise. So I said, okay, well, I have to figure out what's going on. At first, of course, my natural inclination was, no, it's not that. You've got to hear it the way I'm here. But of course, so this was a classic case, I think, of over listening to something, right?
Yeah.
As I was fiddling and playing with these things, I became so attuned to what they were doing that it sounded to me like I was playing this, A minor, C, whatever, and the flute, over top. And yet, okay, so I let it sit for a couple months, and I came back and I listened to it, and sure enough, I could hear just what Tom was talking about. It was just this like, it was a little bit, it wasn't unpleasant or anything, but it was like this undulating mass of, weird or inharmonic organy sounds intertwining with each other.
Right.
And so, interestingly, I could force myself to hear it the other way, the way I had originally been hearing.
And this was 2.2 as an octave stretch, because I'm thinking about that. For our listeners, in JI, I guess, if you have a 2.2 to 2 ratio, that's like 22 over 20, which is like 11 over 10. So that is, that's almost a small whole tone. Like, that's more than a semitone of stretch.
It's basically a semitone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
if a semitone is 16 over 15, 11 over 10 is like even larger. So I guess I'd call that a large neutral second.
And that's what prompted me to start looking much more carefully at these sort of fusion ideas. Because what had happened there was, for me, as someone enmeshed and over listening to this stuff, I was hearing it fused together.
Yeah.
Yet, clearly, a naive listener in that case, it was completely unfused. It was not a single note. What I was perceiving as a note was a sound mass. And, that's not how you want to compose. You want to compose so that the thing you think you're hearing is what your audience should be hearing.
Right.
Yeah.
So could there be some kind of sweet spot? Say, for example, you have your tuning, your set of pitches to be a stretched octave of, say, 2.2. But then for the instrument that you're using, could you tune the overtones, those individual partials, maybe 2.1 and have it sit somewhere in between? It might be an extreme example, but could that work?
Yeah, I think you can play all sorts of games.
Yeah.
So how can you can also do tricks to promote the fusion of the sound. So, for example, a trick that would promote fusion would be like a vibrato or any kind of modulation that ties together all the overtones. So, if all the overtones are wiggling at the same rate up and down,
yeah,
then that will tend to make that sound glom together.
Right.
And so you can play tricks like that, but you have to know that you need to play the tricks in order to think of applying them.
Yeah. Also, in my experience messing around with these ideas, I found that sustained organ-like envelopes, as it were, they kind of sound a bit weird, whereas something that is more percussive works a lot better. I don't know if you've
so you can carry
experienced
that to an extreme. If you go back to my my lists of what sounds work in different tunings, the
Right.
xylophone works in almost anything. Plunk, 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 plunk.
Oh, yeah.
Plunk, right? You can play the xylophone in 10 tone, you can play it in 13, you can play, right? And why is that? It's because the dissonance percept does not have time to build. I mean, it takes time for dissonance to occur. It's not an instantaneous thing. And so I think, so if the sound dies away essentially faster than that perception can build up, then it's not the cause of things. I mean, the Mbira, it's these little tines that you pluck, right? And they're sort of teardrop shaped. I mean, the larger ones do have some sustain, but of course the smallest ones tend to be more plinky, more short envelope, I should say. Yeah.
I've got another question that's kind of related, although I don't know if it's going to be jumping into the deep end, but I wanted to ask for potential
Aren't we already
strategies.
there?
Deep end.
So let's say, for example, you have, as a starting point, you're using a sound that's kind of like a sawtooth wave. So the overtones have harmonic relationships, but you want to play, let's say, 10-tone equal temperament, or let's go for an extreme example, 5-tone equal temperament, where the pitches in your scale are actually spaced quite far apart. But as you go really high up in the overtone series, they're getting very close together. So what kind of strategies are there for blending those overtones together, given that there may be many overtones that would assign to a single note of the scale?
So, all right, the answer to that is unfortunately fairly technical.
I worried that.
Well, in the sense that, okay, I mentioned that when you're doing these kind of manipulations, you're effectively taking a string of numbers that represent different frequencies. Many of them are small numbers that represent where overtones are not. Some of them are high amplitudes where the overtones are. And now your strategy is moving those things, up or down in frequency as dictated by wanting to get close to the 5-tone or whatever scale you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Now, so the mechanics of doing that turn out to be fairly important in terms of maintaining the integrity of the sound. It turns out that the picture I just gave you is a little bit oversimplified. And you can't just look at the single location closest to the overtone, but rather you have to look at a small region about the overtone. And so when you move it around, you actually need to move that whole region. So this was something I discovered basically by ear, by conceptualizing it, trying the obvious thing, which was you just move the big thing over. And I actually went through, I want to say, a handful of really quite different numerical techniques for handling this problem. This thing about essentially moving the cluster that's around the overtone is probably the most successful of them.
Okay.
And but the reason that kind of speaks to your question is because now you have to move not a single isolated point up, but you have to move an area up.
Yeah.
And so you have to how closely can you map your overtones? Well, no closer than that cluster, right? Because you can, if half the cluster's on one side and you move the other one right up against it, that's a cluster width apart. And so conceptually, I think that's really a detail, but practically it makes quite a difference in sort of how integral the sound remains. In other words, so to take your sawtooth example, how much like a sawtooth will it sound when you get to 5-tone equal temperament? Well, it's got to do with how far you move those clusters and how closely those clusters are spaced.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean by a technical answer, right? It's like, it would be the sort of thing that if we sat down with some computer code.
Yeah, we could go through all of these different strategies.
You could go through it, but for the picture, that's I think about right.
Yeah. Okay. See, I ran into this problem before when I in university. I kind of built an additive synth in my final year.
Oh yeah.
And I was experimenting with this, where you would input a equal temperament for your tuning, and then it would kind of move partials around. It wasn't very good.
Okay.
I ran into that problem quite quickly and realized, how am I going to do this?
It isn't so easy to move those partials around, yeah.
Yeah. And I saw many different solutions. You know, you could just take the nearest partial and then you could just mute the rest. And then that doesn't sound very good because it thins the sound,
really
and then
well,
it just makes each note itself sound like a chord.
Right.
If you tune each overtone perfectly to notes of the scale, yeah, it just sounds like a big chord.
Right.
You lose that fusion. It sounded okay in the end, what I had. But
When I do that stuff, I sometimes consider attack time and critical band. Is that something that's kind of built into, well, how you make sounds with the dissonance curve a little bit?
Well, yeah. So critical band, of course, was the thing that Plomp and Levelt invented.
Yeah.
Right? That's the piece that they added to the mix. And the essence of the dissonance curve then was that when things are really close, they sound, nice and sort of like a slow pleasant vibrato. When things are too far apart, they sound like separate things.
Right.
And so the dividing line between too close and too far is essentially the critical band.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So the answer to your question is yes, absolutely, it involves the critical band. And because your ear does not resolve things, well, to first approximation, you don't resolve overtones that are within a single critical band. So rather they become one thing which has this sort of beating phenomenon, or they become one thing that the other thing that can happen is it can get masked.
Right.
And so so you mentioned Richard Parncut a little bit earlier.
Yes.
I mean, he has a great model of masking.
Right.
And I've never actually used. I've looked at it and used it, and it's a highly accurate model. It's great if you need to take masking into account, but if you don't need to take masking into account, it's a pain in the butt to include it in the calculations.
Right.
So mostly I've not included it, but there are some things where if you want a fuller explanation, you have to include that kind of effect.
Absolutely.
Let me give you an example. So white noise, right? You know what that is, right? It's sort of a shh, like you'd get out of an untuned radio or something.
Yes.
Well, if you listen to it, it's not really all that dissonant, right? It's just a shh sound.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yet, if you were to apply my model or Plomp and Levelt's model naively, you would say we've got overtones at every location. So there's lots of overtones in that roughness region. This ought to be the most dissonant thing in the universe.
Right, exactly.
So there's an example where my model is very much oversimplified. I mean, I think the sort of solution to the problem is now this is a situation, things are so dense that you have to include the masking. And when you do that, effectively what happens is all the stuff within each critical band basically gets agglomerated together. And so that the total dissonance is more like the dissonance between those critical bands rather than the sum up of all the separate overtones.
Oh, yeah. Right. That gets complicated really quick.
And so the model gets more complicated. And there's always a tension when you're modeling. You want to model the things that are most important to you, and you don't want to model those things that you don't need to because they just gum up the works. A theory of everything would need to include everything, right? So there's an example of something that really my model does not work on.
I've got another random thing that I'm curious about, but I don't know.
Okay.
It's not something I have experience with, but maybe Stephen. Spectralism, the spectralists. So how much of what they are doing?
So this is like Tristan Murray and
yeah.
So I didn't even know about them when I wrote Tuning Timbre. And one of the criticisms of one of the first people that read through the book for me was, hey, this sounds a lot like spectralism. You know, how can you not talk about it? So I ran out and figured out what they were doing. So let me oversimplify a bit for the purpose of compare and contrast. So what the spectralist sort of idea is to take, let's say you do a decomposition of a sound, like, trombone sound or a string sound. Okay, so now you have all the overtones located at the locations they're at. Now, tune an instrument to each of those pitches. So what you're doing is you're playing, let's just say you play a flute at the first overtone of the guitar, another flute at the second overtone, another flute at the third overtone, fourth overtone, fifth overtone. So now you've built a chord that is, not an equal tempered chord at all, because these pitches, the overtones don't exactly occur on scale steps. And so you've built up some kind of emulation of that original analyzed sound, in this case the guitar sound, out of flutes. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of core idea. And then, of course, they elaborate that in 1,000 different ways. So you can see that's sort of a different idea than moving the overtones around. Each flute has its own spectrum, and so the aggregation is not just the original sound. It's not an exact analysis synthesis mechanism. I suppose it is a kind of synthesis mechanism, but it's not exact. So that's that's one way to think about the relationship between the two. They relate it, of course, in the sense that we're both playing with overtones. So if the instruments you chose to reassemble it with were sine waves, then you would be doing an exact analysis resynthesis, and that would be similar kind of to the things we're doing.
Yeah.
Oh, and of course, if they started with a sound that was inharmonic to begin with, then maybe that would be even closer.
Yeah, sure. You would start with a bell, say, and then you'd build your bell out of guitars or something like that.
It's pretty cool. I really like spectral music that makes use of like auditory illusions. It kind of is something that microtonality does a lot, but then does it in a different way where, the ear can be like tricked in all these various ways into hearing things that aren't there, part of which is pitch related. Like chimes don't even, like the pitch that you hear from a chime when you strike it isn't actually being sounded in the bars, it's virtual pitch. So pieces that like do that, like something that Hubert Howe has written. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He's been coming around to a few conferences in the Midwest, and he had this really cool piece that they put on at Ball State where there were a lot of periodic-like frequencies going on, but then the auditory illusions that were from them were sort of really insane. But he wasn't, like, doing anything with, I don't think, his inharmonic scale per se, but it was such that, like, you heard some periodic sound that was, like, low mids, and, like, based on the way you turned your head, you would hear a different pitch, or what you thought was hearing would go away entirely. It kind of sounded like what you were doing with the 2.2 stretched octave, where, like, reality is sort of warping.
Well, remember, what you hear is a function of what is in the real world, the sound waves that are, existing in the room. But a large part of what you hear is just what's going on in your brain.
Yes.
How your brain is interpreting things.
Absolutely.
And so, so auditory illusions are fascinating. If you know, like, Diana Deutsch,
mm-hmm.
has her work is just spectacular.
It really is.
And she's got a couple of different CDs just filled with different illusions. She just says some meaningless sentences, and then she loops it, and as you listen during the loop, it takes on this melody, and of course the melody's there, but it's also you've fabricated it.
Yes.
In your brain.
Yeah, and then when you hear the entire quote with that one little loops bit.
And then
context,
it jumps out.
You just hear this melody jump out. Yeah, it's really interesting.
That's a spectacular one. Hearing what you do with this, 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 hearing what you do with this.
Well, I think we might be about out of time. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for inviting us, and looking forward to hearing what you do with this somewhat stream of consciousness.
Yeah, can't wait.
It's been a pleasure.
All right.
And good to meet you guys.
Yeah, great to meet you all. Well, this has been Bill Sethares and Kevin Hobby with the Hyperpiano, consonance and dissonance, many other fascinating mathematical theories. So thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. We'll see you later.